Okay, salam everyone. This is going to be chapter 6 of our reading in the Black Jews of Africa. This will be our last chapter in part 2 of Black Judaism. This will be encountering and reinventing the Africans and the Jews in the colonial era, 15th to 19th centuries. And in this particular chapter, we will be delving into more white supremacy distortions, colonialism, along with putting the original people of the Bible back in its proper place. So let's proceed here. The Africans as Caucasoid. The Hamitic hypothesis, born in post-medieval Europe, is part of the African genesis. It prevailed for many years and conditioned how reality was broken down by various European players involved in Africa. In particular, it would put Africa's genealogy to the test. A brief overview of the Hamitic hypothesis shows the importance of its influence for both Europeans and Africans themselves. Basically, this theory argues that anything of value found in Africa was brought there by the Hamites, who are allegedly a branch of the Caucasian race. In the well-known work Races of Africa, 1930, the white supremacist English anthropologist Charles Seligman wrote, apart from relatively late Semitic influence, the civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites. Its history, the record of these peoples, and their interaction with the two other African stocks, the Negro and the Bushman, whether this influence was exerted by highly civilized Egyptians or by such wider pastoralists, are represented at the present day by the Beja and Somali. The incoming Hamites were pastoral Europeans, arriving wave after wave, better armed as well as quicker witted than the dark agricultural Negroes. The notion of black Hamite derived from the ancient tradition identifying the sons of Ham with Africans was widely accepted by 1600. In one of the first post-medieval references, Leo Africanus, the great Arabian traveler, wrote about black Africans that they descended from Ham. The translator of the English edition, John Pori, added to the text in his own commentary entitled a summarized discourse of the manifold of religions professed in Africa, in which he underlined the punishment suffered by Ham and his descendants, and thus reinforced the myth in modern times. This interpretation remained further in Christian circles during the 19th century. Indeed, during Vatican Council of 1870, 68 bishops asked for the anathema weighing on the descendants of Ham to be lifted. The wish has remained unfulfilled. This mythical concept is both vague and complex. An analysis of the epistemological shift from the early Hamitic theory, whereby Hamites were allegedly blacks, to the later notion of a Hamitic race shows how the myth's survival can be attributed to its ideological usefulness, to which its ambiguity actually contributed. As Francois Xavier Fauvel stressed, Ham is black when ideology demands a tangible mark of a curse that dooms him to slavery. Ham is white when ideology impresses the idea that only that which is white is civilized. Black thus means not to be civilized. Ham is red when red evokes the first ages. Black then means without a past. That the name of Ham is used for the black or the white individual in any case highlights the opposition between the two, an opposition that would be played out not only in the anthropological field but also in the religious, linguistic, social, political, and economic arenas. Although derived from a religious source, the notion of black Hamites' inferiority traversed the 17th century to become, in the expansion of scientific research during the 18th century, the subject of great debate. Researchers of the end of the century and philosophers of the Enlightenment attempted to identify scientific methods to the study of man, often in direct conflict with the scriptures regarding his origin. They broadened the debate. At the end of the 18th century, two views coexisted about blacks. They were the result of degeneration. See how they reverse it? Due to environmental conditions, or as part of polygenism. They were a separate creation with subhuman characteristics. These ideas were compatible with some interests of the period, such as colonialism. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 prompted a new European interest in Egyptians and provided food for the Hamitic myth. Napoleon's scientists discovered the extraordinary fact that civilization began before Greeks and Romans. Their attention was drawn to the people who lived there among these ancient splendors and who were believed to descend from the people who created them. It was a very mixed population, as it is today, with significant variations in physiognomy and physical types, ranging from dark to black. French scientists concluded that Egyptians were Negroid. Vivant Denon, 1747 to 1825, who participated in Napoleon's expedition, described them as follows: a broad and flat nose, very short, a large flattened mouth, thick lips, etc. He agreed on this point with the convictions of the Count of Volney, who had spent 4 years in Egypt and Syria and had expressed a similar point of view. If the African descended from Ham and Ham were cursed, how could he create a great civilization? The paradox of a Negroid people at the origin of the earliest civilization presented a challenge to the doctrine circulating in the West. Egypt had become the center of great interest among both scientists and a wider general audience. A number of works that were published about Egypt and the Egyptians soon after the expedition of Egypt tried therefore to demonstrate that the Egyptians were not black. William G. Brown, a traveler and typical exponent of this way of thinking, had the unusual idea of maintaining that the purpose of mummies was simply to leave a physical trace of the individual. The presence of mummies provided proof that these people were not black, and above all, that they wanted the information to be passed on. Pre-science of that people concerning errors into which posterity might fall, exhibits irrefragable proofs of features and of color of their skin. According to new interpretations of the scriptures, the Egyptians became the descendants of Mitzrayim, one of the sons of Ham. The stories of the sons of Ham were debated, in particular the curse. About this issue, Reverend Michael Russell wrote, in the sacred writings of Hebrews, Egypt is called Mitzrayim, the name which is applied to Egypt by the Arabs of the present day. The Copts retain the native word Chemia, which perhaps has some relation to Cam, the son of Noah, or, as Plutarch insinuates, may only denote that darkness of color which appears in a rich soil or in human eye. Although this latter point did not meet with much success, The reading of biblical dictionaries of the period reveals the general acceptance of the new Caucasoid Hamites who were not cursed and who were capable of developing a high civilization. The Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature, published in 1846 by John Kitto, includes a long article entitled Ham, which underlines that the curse of Noah was directed only against Canaan, while acknowledging the difficulty of tracing the history of the most important Hamitic nations, the Cushites, Phoenicians, and Egyptians, due to their mixing with foreign peoples. As the first decades of the 19th century saw a new development of the Hamitic myth, its scientific basis was also being strengthened. Craniology in the United States and in Europe led to the belief that the osteological characteristics of the Egyptians were Caucasian, which made it possible to explain their achievements on the basis of an innate racial superiority and to exclude blacks from any possibility of great achievements. The young science of philology also added weight to the Hamitic theory at a time when language and race were considered inextricably linked. Christian K. Bunsen, both a philologist and an Egyptologist, postulated that the Hamite or Egyptian had existed before the Semite and was antediluvian, which according to him was absolute proof that the Hamitic language belonged to the Caucasoid people. The idea was widely accepted by travelers and theologians of the period. By the end of the 19th century, colonialism and modern racism had molded European attitudes toward Africa and Africans. Joseph de Gobineau gave the clearest expression of an ancient penetration of the African continent by a primary branch of the white race. This primordial descent of the superior race, described in epic terms, would have taken place around 5000 BC. Whilst the first conquest was difficult due to the thickness of the attacked masses and to the resistance, either furious or stupidly inert, the preservation of the states made possible by the victory required just as much effort. As a consequence, the ethnocentrism of travelers and colonists in the 19th century increased the standing of those who resembled them the most. These were declared to be Hamites or of Hamitic descent, endowed with the greater ability and even exerted a positive influence among African groups. John Hanning Speke, the English traveler who discovered the source of the Nile, originated the Hamitic theory in its modern form. When the kingdom of Buganda was discovered, with its complex political organization, he designated the Gala Hamites as the first bearers of culture in Africa, thanks to the intellectual superiority of all Caucasoids, while simultaneously putting forward that they could achieve real development only with the help of the white race. The existence of differential social categories, contrasting activities, and relatively diverse physical types in the kingdoms located between Lake Victoria, Albert, and Tanganyika facilitated the extension of the hypothesis of foreign infiltration. These ideas appear at the same time in Europe. For instance, the French traveler Pierre Trémaux, whose work was awarded a prize by the Institut de France, Institut de Francais, explained that successive white waves were blackened by the climate. In another version, Martial de Salviac, a French Capuchin missionary, explained that the Gala were of Gala origin because of an ancient expedition. The history of Africa was thus created through a succession of invasions, leading to various degrees of mixing, requiring every more complex theories. For instance, Antoine de Preville explained in 1894 that a variety of the white race lived among the Africans, and that this group could even be represented by colored nations. In 1902, during the 8th International Congress of Geography in Washington, a certain Romane de Calade claimed in his lecture that the legendary founder of the kingdom of Buganda, Kintu, was a descendant of a group of Christians from Nubia who had been baptized by Saint Matthew, and that in 1307 these proto-Christians from Uganda had even sent an envoy to Beijing to ask for missionaries. Any cultural progress was thus linked to an invasion. The Nuba population, the Nuba population wrote A. Lefebvre in 1892, reddened by Asian and Libyan blood, was thus awakened by contact with superior races. The stereotype of the Asian myth dear to Gobanu would lead positivist authors who continue to use the terms Hamite or Kamite to develop a theory about Asian invasions. Joseph Halevi, a French anthropologist using craniology and linguistics as a starting point, invoked an article by Fulgence Fresnel about Southern Arabian languages to conclude that the settlement of Kamites in Asia dates back much further than the settlement on the African soil. This process presented a double advantage for colonial goals. It kept Africans in a position of inferiority while promoting the idea that civilization could be achieved only by the white race. The ideological framework of colonial expansion was then set, and as was observed by J. Barzoon, politics and race theory seemed natural allies for colonial expansion and exploitation. Developed further and diversified at the beginning of the 20th century, the confusions surrounding the Hamitic myth increased as new classifications searched for validity. Linguistic typologies were built on racial types, while the racial classifications themselves depended on linguistic definitions. The racial classification of Hamites included a wide variety of types from the fair-skinned, blue-eyed blonde Berber to the black Ethiopian. The first racial typology was set up by Giuseppe Sergi in his book The Mediterranean Race, 1901. In the chapter devoted to Hamites, he claimed that these people settled originally in the cradle of Mediterranean races in Eastern Africa. He described Hamites as follows. Some African populations occupied a large territory and exhibited a remarkable homogeneity as regards their morphological characteristics and to a lesser degree as regards their external characteristics. As well, the languages they spoke in the past are still now. I wish to speak about populations known by the Old World. Hamitic especially because of their linguistic characteristics, which contributed to their classification and regrouping them together as a single race. They still display the physical traits of the race in spite of the incongruous and hybrid shapes which have shown themselves. Sergi insisted on the morphological unity of these diverse peoples, among who were the inhabitants of the Sahara, the Berbers, and even peoples who have a wholly or partially lost their language, such as Egyptians, Watutsi, and the Masi. From 1880 on, the presentation of a Hamitic race grouping together the inhabitants of the Sahara, the Berbers, the Egyptians, the Abyssinians, the people of the Horn of Africa, and some groups of East Africa, the Masi and Tutsi Hima, spread throughout Europe and in particular in Germany via the publication of The History of Mankind by Ratzel, the great anthropogeographer. In 1913, in England, Sir Henry Johnston, a great traveler and high-level official of the Crown, wrote in the same publication where Seligman had expounded his Hamitic theory, a long article that defended the general theory that a high intellectual development necessarily signified Caucasian blood. The Hamites discovered in sub-Saharan Africa were described as pastors, with blacks allegedly being farmers. Moreover, the particular fate reserved for the Kafres, the Bantu-speaking peoples of southern Africa, in mid-century geographical science is striking. In France, Dr. Jean-Jacques Verret, who included in this denomination all the peoples of Eastern Africa, noted that these peoples are prouder and more handsome than the real Negroes, in that they are naturally pastors and builders of empires. As underlined by Sanders, pastoralism in all its attributes became endowed with an aura of cultural superiority, conferring on some groups a third dimension, a cultural identity. Historians such as Anson P. Atterbury in Islam in Africa, 1899, and John W. Gregory in the Foundation of British East Africa, 1901, began to compile writings on Africa, accepted all these elements as proven as indisputable facts, and presented them as historical explanations of Africa's past. Roland Oliver argues in The Missionary Factor in East Africa, 1952, that this mechanism provided the fodder for missionaries who wanted to learn more about general ethnology and whose work complemented ethnological research of the period. In a book by Armand de Quatrefages, published in 1889, a drawing of the king of Lesotho's son, Moshesh, dressed as a Victorian bourgeois man, was accompanied by comments about the crossbreeding of the Sotho with superior races, and constituted a picturesque example of the mentality of the period. Biology was supposed to justify the diversity of ethnological situations. A large majority of anthropologists supported the Hamitic myth. Each trace or sign of what was called civilized in Africa was attributed to foreign origins, primarily Hamitic. Thus, ironworking was considered as having been introduced to African by others, along with complex political institutions or irrigation systems. Important archaeological discoveries were also attributed to external influences and kept Africans out of their own cultural history. For example, Dutch and English colonists who encountered who encounter only Bushmen or Hottentots, had no reason to believe that the ancient greatness of Great Zimbabwe could be attributed to Africans, and so oriented their researches and studies exclusively toward foreign origins. The Hamitic myth was challenged by only a few critics. Henry Spencer, in the introduction to Sociologia Descriptive des Races Africaines, 1930, denounced the supporters of this theory of racial prejudice and ethnocentrism. Joseph Greenberg also attacked the entire Hamitic myth by suggesting that the terms be abandoned. He referred to the fact that non-Semitic languages of Hamitic Semitic family do not form a linguistic unity as do the Semitic languages. The term Hamitic, which is reserved for use, is not supposed by any valid linguistic unity. Despite such criticism, St. Clair Drake could still conclude in 1959 that the Hamitic myth is so anchored in common thought, as in Caucasian superiority, that it could only be eradicated through patient efforts, including among scholars of African origin. Eventually, the ideology carried by the Hamitic myth lost ground after World War II. Even though its influence persisted in later works, even Basil Davidson, a pro-African, anti-racist author, advanced in his book Old Africa Rediscovered, 1959, a version of the Hamitic hypothesis by identifying a racial African group called Hamites, while simultaneously fighting against the racist assumptions made by the myth. As African notions gained their independence, some scholars began to cast doubt on the Hamitic hypothesis as they rejected colonial ties and discovered the indigenous achievements of the past. The Hamitic myth, however, had instilled the mixing of the black by the white at the same time as the concept of a white with a black skin, and authorized the detection of invasions, which according to Chrétien became the mannerism of African ethnology. In the African ethnology of the beginning of the 20th century, such concepts led to the idea that the continent was inhabited by two groups, the Caucasians and the Negroids, as well as mixtures of the two. Caucasoid and Negro types were considered as absolute and universal, represented in the same way in biology, linguistics, and the cultural and political aspects of the black individual. Although the academic dimension of the Hamitic hypothesis has fallen into disuse, the word Hamite still exists and now carries a mythical meaning. The vague fusion of Hamitic Semitic notions would come to constitute the basis of a pattern of thought, which, after having conditioned European colonists, would also shape Africans' interiority up to the present. In a course taught in March 1960 at the Busaria Seminar in Burundi, one could read, according to the most widespread theory, the cradle of Hamites is Western Asia. These Asians went to Africa eons ago by the way of Isthmus of Suez. And especially the Bab el-Mandeb Strait on the way from southern Asia, where they had already been subjected to Semitic influences. Reinventing the Jews in the New World and in Africa. In his first accounts of the native populations of the New World, Christopher Columbus noted in a letter, the content of which was spread all over Europe, that the Arawak Indians do not hold any creed, nor are they idolaters. Amerigo Vespucci, in his Mundus Novus, confirms this point. Beyond the facts they have no church nor religion and are not idolaters, what can I say? Similarly, early accounts on Africa often noted an absence of religion. In the 16th and 17th centuries, travel accounts frequently associated the lack of religion with the absence of other characteristics defining humanity, such as the institution of marriage, a system of law, or any formalized social or political organization. During the 18th century, when a trade zone opened up on the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English Christians, Arabs and African Muslims, African Christians, and African followers of local religions set up a relationship for social and economical exchanges. It was then that some practices such as fetishism came to represent in the eyes of 18th century traders an additional example of their absence of religion. Later on, this absence of religion was confirmed by Richard Burton in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, by James Grant in his Walk Across Africa, and by Rene Calais in his Journey to Timbuktu. It was also noted repeatedly in southern Africa by explorers, colonists, missionaries, and even civil servants throughout the 19th century. Only in Ethiopia, a Christian country, inhabitants were considered since Greco-Roman antiquity to be pioneers as regards religion. These European observers clearly based their reactions on the Christian model of religion that was the most accessible to them, and which provided a radical orientation for their interpretation of native customs. However, they also drew analogies between indigenous customs and the religions known to them. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans assumed that there were 4 religions in the world: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and paganism, the latter being often subdivided into ancient, barbaric, and devilish forms. They had no trouble extending the scope of religious diversity to include the cultivated and sacerdotal sacerdotal religions of India, China, and Japan, because the identification of written and ritual traditions in Asia provided sufficient analogies with forms of religion that were familiar to them. By virtue of a similar process, the beliefs and practices of indigenous peoples were considered as being derived from ancient sources. In most cases, Hebrew religion. In North and South America, as in Africa and Australia, this vision of the world easily gave rise to historical hypotheses that native peoples were descended from the Hebrews and the 10 tribes. Parfit has shown how the Hebrew language played a crucial role since the Middle Ages, together with the myth of the 10 tribes, in European imagination. He analyzed the pivotal role of Hebrew as an invented language in colonial discourses, showing how many of the languages encountered by Europeans were interpreted as being related to Hebrew or other Semitic languages. The fact that Jews and native peoples were similarly stereotyped in Europeans' minds contributed to the development of the theory that American Indians descended from Jewish stock. After all, the religious practices of both these groups provided objects of contrast for European understandings. Colonial fantasies in the New World. The propensity to see similarities between ancient Judaism and the religion of the savages was partially the result of stereotypes held about both contemporary savages and contemporary Jews in European minds for the 16th from the 16th to the 17th century. Being anti-Christian, the two categories were described as only half human and posed the same problem. That is, how could they be converted? European authors used the same language and images to describe the religious practices of contemporary Jews and those of the New World savages. Spaniards had long experience of prejudice about Jews. When Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492, he believed he had arrived in certain islands off the coast of Asia, while paradoxically he thought that he had discovered a biblical land. In 1511, when he recounted how Columbus identified Española as Ophir, Pedro Martir de Angleria suggested the possibility of a Jewish origins of the inhabitants of the New World. If Española were Ophir, Solomon's sailors could have left behind the ancestors of the Indians. This opinion was readopted by many Spanish authors, and in 1540 a manuscript of Dr. Roldan attempted to demonstrate that the Indians of India, of the islands and inland and of the Indian Sea, presently under the rule of the kingdoms of Castle, are Hebrews descended from the 10 tribes of Israel. One of the reasons evoked by Roldan to support his thesis is the similarity of customs between Indians and Hebrews. They practice circumcision, daily and abundant ablutions in sea, rivers, springs, and lakes. They are forbidden to touch the dead. The caciques and high leaders, their caciques and high leaders often have many wives, as is written about certain fathers of the Old Testament. Roldan's thesis was taken up again and further developed some years later by the Dominican father Diego Duran in his work Historia de las Indias de Nueva España y Islas de Tierra Firme, 1867, which saw in the destiny of the new world populations the accomplishment of all biblical curses. Indeed, stresses Duran, there could not be greater authority and reasons to make us understand that those Indians are Jews and that they descended from them. In 1607, the Dominican Gregorio Garcia, who became Grand Inquisitor, collected the many different theories that the Indians were literally of Jewish stock into a famous book, Origen de los Indios del Nuevo Mundo, 1729. He wrote, "Many have supposed the Spanish generally who reside in the Indies believe that the Indians proceed from the 10 Jewish tribes who were lost in the captivity of Salmanasar, king of Assyria." Garcia insisted that the Indians seemed to retain some aspects of the Mosaic law, that the Incas had a ceremony similar to Passover, that the Indians of the Yucatan practiced circumcision, and that the Mexicans and the Incas maintained eternal fires as did the Jews. This theory also appeared in the Spanish-controlled area and in Northern Europe with the publication in 1567 in Antwerp of the work of Johannes Fredericus Lumnius de extremo de indicio et indurum vocatione, which also introduced obscure theological arguments in support okay, lost the Okay. Similar. We'll start from up here. The dissemination of these theories aroused significant controversy. Thus, José de Acosta devoted a full chapter of his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias. José de Acosta devoted a full chapter of his Okay. The dissemination of these theories aroused significant controversy. Thus, José de Acosta devoted a full chapter of his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias to the demonstration that the widespread opinion according to which the Indians are of Jewish lineage is false, pointing out the fact that, unlike the Hebrews, the inhabitants of the New World do not know how to write. Similar disapproval of the hypothesis of the Jewish origin of the Indians was voiced by Juan de Torquemada in his work published in 1615. The earliest printed work supporting the thesis that the Native Americans were of Hebrew descent was Conographia, published in 1570 by Gilbert Génébrard, a French theologian and Hebraist. Génébrard refers to the account of one of his contemporaries, the cosmographer monk André Thevet, who had reported the discovery in the Azores of gravestones with inscription in Hebrew letters, using it as an argument to confirm that the Hebrew people were not only present in the land of Judea, but throughout this great universe. English authors also analyzed common elements between the Hebrew religion and that of the American natives. The missionary John Eliot, in a brief narrative of the progress of the gospel among the Indians in New England in the year 1670, adopted the view that the Indians were descendants of the ancient Jews and considered that his work of conversion of the American Jews would contribute to the coming of the end of the world. Thomas Thorogood, in Jews in America or Probabilities That Americans Are That Race, 1650, argues that the Indians must be descendants of the Jews because the rites, fashions, ceremonies, and opinions of the Americans, Indians, are in many things agreeable to the custom of the Jews, not only to the profane and common usages, but such as be called solemn and sacred. In response to Thorogood's book, Hammond Lestrange in 1652 wrote, Americans no use or probabilities that the Americans are of that race, without denying all the arguments of the former, but recalling that these customs also existed among other peoples who were clearly not of Jewish origin. In the same way, Lescarbot, who thought that it was Noah's descendants who had populated America, established, among other things, parallels between the practice of exclusion of menstruating women in the Mosaic Law and among the Indians. The book of Father Lafitau, Mors de Savages Americanis Compares Aux Mores des Premiers Temps, published in 1724, represents the culmination of the tradition comparing the practices of ancient Jews with those of Native Americans. Lafitau, in presenting Native American populations as having been separated from the rest of humanity before the revelation of Moses, attempted to demonstrate that the similarities between Indian and Jewish practices represented proof of their common religion since Adam. As Eilberg Schwartz notes, anthropologists and ethnologists have already emphasized the way in which Lafitau anticipated many crucial developments in the emergence of their disciplines. He goes